Welcome, welcome, welcome. Last time we left off with an empty scene. So our poor little token character was sitting in the middle of nowhere in this grey mass. In this session we're going to add some more features to our scene so that our players can see the setting in which their characters exist. So right clicking on our haunted house and going to configure. The first thing we're going to do is add a background image. So we'll just select a background image. Now in this case, I am in the user data area and I've already preloaded some images. So this one is a pirate tavern, courtesy of Chepeku. And if I save that, you'll now see that my character is sitting amongst a pirate tavern rather than a haunted house, but it'll serve the purpose. And one thing you can notice is when we zoom in that we have these very faint lines and then some thick lines. That's because this image is already pre-gridded. Now I deliberately loaded the gridded image so that I could show you something, and that is if we don't align the image as it was originally conceived in terms of its grid with our grid as Foundry VTT understands it, then we end up with a situation where our character won't move properly around the scene. So you can see that if I move this character, so if I move this character here around the scene, you'll see it doesn't follow the grid as defined by the image. Okay, so if I move to this side, you can see I'm now halfway between two grid panels. Okay, and that would cause me difficulties as I move around. So what we need to do is we need to align the grid of our game with the grid as conceived of by the image. Now I happen to know that most Chepeku maps are 140 pixel by 140 pixel grids, whereas the default grid size for a scene in our Foundry, the default setup, is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. That's the reason we get this some odd offset. So we go to our settings, so configure our scene, and now we're going to go to grid, and where it says grid size 100, we change that to be 140. If we now save that and we say yes, we do want to change it. Now we just have to move our character onto one of the now conceived of grids, and you can see that our grid's now aligned. So I can now move around and the grid on the image perfectly matches the grid as seen by Foundry. I now no longer need the grid on the image itself. I can rely on the grid as set by Foundry. So now we will go in and we will do configure, and we're now going to swap out that image, whereas it was this gridded version, G underscore. If I now go to the GL version of the same image, this is the grid-less image. If I now select that and save the changes, you'll now notice that we don't have the dark grid lines, we've only got the pale grid lines as defined by our grid. So it's a lot less intrusive, and I've got more control over it. I can make the grid darker or lighter as I see fit. So that's now got our token sitting on a nice background. Okay, so that's one layer. So we've now got two layers effectively. We've got the layer on which the token moves, and we've got the background layer, which is the layer on which our map sits. Now, because the background layer conceptually lays below the token layer, our tokens will always be visible. Now, there's one more layer that we're going to look at in this session, and that is the foreground image layer. So if I set the foreground image layer, I'm going to set it to this, which is just a very light mist effect. Okay, so you can see that this is now applied a sort of mist effect. Now, where our character now is the character's sort of moderately bright, but if I move the character to an area which is more misty, you can see that the character becomes more indistinct. Okay, I can move it back up here and it becomes more distinct. And that's because we've now got a layer of sort of mist and cloud over the top of the token layer. Okay, so that is the sort of 3 layers we're going to deal with at the moment. Now, there is one more layer actually on this scene. If I go back to the GM's view, what you can see here is this grey back here. Now, this is the real background color. Okay, so there's a background color that effectively lies beneath all of the other images, and that's what this grey is. And we can change that. So if we go into configure, you can see here that we've got the background color set to 99999, which is that grey, and I can change that to be red. And if I change it, then the background becomes red. Generally speaking, I just leave it as a fairly neutral color, 9999999. Is good enough. Okay, so whether or not I use the foreground layer depends on the scene that I'm trying to set. Okay, so in this case, if I want it to just be constantly in this sort of misty state, then the foreground serves a purpose. But quite often the scene won't have a foreground image. Coming over to the other display, I've got an image here that explains these layers. So you can see what we've got here is the background color, okay, effectively laying at the bottom. Then we've got the background image, which was our base map. Then we've got the token layer, and then we've got the foreground image, which is, in this case, was the sort of misty cloud effect. Okay, so what's this stuff down the left-hand side where I'm talking about the elevation? That is the distance, usually expressed in feet, of the height of any object above some 0 point. So if I go to here, you can see that my foreground elevation is currently set to 20 feet. That means that the quote clouds are 20 feet above the background. The background is at 0. Now our token sits on the token layer, and as this diagram shows, the token is sitting on the token layer, and that is also notionally at 0 feet. Okay, so the background image, although the background is beneath the tokens, it is still at 0 feet elevation. But our token has an elevation of its own relative to this token layer. To demonstrate this, let's take our token. I'll just zoom in on him again. Okay, and I'm going to put him somewhere misty so that we can see this. Okay, so our token is now standing beneath some mist, and if I right click on here, this number here is his elevation, and you can see that he's currently at 0 feet. Now I just said that the cloud layer was at 20 feet, so if I make our character fly, so his elevation is at 30 feet, he suddenly becomes very clear because he's now above this cloud layer. Okay, similarly, if I set him to 19 feet, he will be just beneath the cloud layer, so he'll go back to being misty. Okay, so he's now misty again. And if I put him back to 0, he's effectively standing on the ground. We'll be discussing elevation quite a lot in future modules. Now, the interesting thing is, if I set him to a negative elevation, let's say negative 10 feet, he's now disappeared, and that's because he is beneath the 0 feet layer. He's underneath the background layer. This is something to be aware of when you're dealing with multi-layer dungeons. If you're going underground, then you really want to consider how your map is going to interact with that. Okay, let's just set him back to 0 feet. Okay, so going back to this diagram again, you can see that the 0 feet layer sort of hovers there. When our token was set to a positive number, it was between the token layer and effectively the infinite height above, so it could go up to and above the foreground layer. Similarly, if I go down, then the character would go down to beneath the 0 feet, and the background color is notionally at minus infinity feet. Okay, what that means is if I go to the symmetry, oops, let's just go and view the source. Okay, so the symmetry doesn't have a background layer. We're effectively standing above just the background color. Okay, if I now set this to 0 to minus 10 feet, well, it doesn't really matter what height it is. You see, he's still visible. Okay, and that's because that background color is underneath everything. There is no way to set a height here that would cause the token to disappear beneath that color. Oops, if you press enter. There we go. Okay. Now the other thing to notice is that the haunted house has got this lovely thumbnail image now, and that's been generated from this background image. Because the symmetry doesn't have a background image, it doesn't have a thumbnail image. Okay, so that is the first setting of our scene, which is to create our map. And we've created a nice foreground effect layer, and our token now, as we've seen, we can move it up and down in elevation, so it can be above or below the foreground layer, above or below the background layer.